Hi, my name is Macy McFarlane, and this is the video journal for week 1. For the first article that I read, it was Ivy Chapter 2, Becoming a Man, Becoming a Woman, Becoming a Person. I apologize if I kind of rant and continue to just ramble. I wrote down a whole bunch of bullet points, so just trying to bring them all together. So for the first article, it goes over how we are born with our biological sex, but gender is socially constructed, and sex is only one component of who someone is, so we can't essentialize that and base it solely off of that. Identity is comprised of different subgroups, and no two identities are the same, and no identity is fixed. There are different things that influence identity development, such as social groups, and then identity development happens through communication, and then identity is a bridge between your interior and exterior, meaning the interior is the sum of your values and beliefs, and the external is your experience with people. Another thing to point out is how gender roles have changed around the Industrial Revolution. So prior to this, men and women shared roles. They're relatively equal in their responsibilities, and then with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, men went out to work, women stayed in at home, and thus gender roles of men kind of changed, and women. So the men became more assertive because they were going out to work all the time and became more successful and more independent and seen as, the breadwinners, and women were staying home more. And because of this, our gender roles that we kind of have now, or gender assumptions that we have now today, are primarily based off of that. They may be a little bit different as time has changed, but primarily the same in terms of women being the caregivers and men being the breadwinners or the assertive ones. So as women's studies are becoming more popular, so are men's studies, in an attempt to change the learned behavior of what it means to be masculine. And then also, I thought an interesting fact that I did not know was that the fetus starts to develop internal female organs or external male organs at about 3 to 4 months. That was something I did not know and I thought was extremely interesting. It's interesting also that I thought was the male penis has been viewed as a symbol of strength and ability, an ability to assert themselves, and the internal women genitalia is paired more with passive and submissive roles. So that was kind of interesting in terms of how the male penis is actually outward physically and the female genitalia is inward physically. And that kind of goes along with the roles that are assigned to men and women in society. So I thought that was really interesting. Also, I thought it was interesting how men are typically classified or described as being strong. That's something you hear all the time. But what I thought was interesting on page 51 of the article was how it goes over that and compared with the actual definition of strength. Research documents 6 differences between males and females. I'll just name a few, but women outlive men by an average of 5 years. Men do not tend to see themselves as ill or susceptible to disease or injury when they are more susceptible. For the top 15 leading causes of death in the United States, men have higher death rates than women, and male fetuses experience many more developmental difficulties and birth defects, and average hours longer to deliver and a higher death rate than female fetuses. So you compare that with what we culturally prescribe to men as being strong, but in all actuality that isn't, the case. So could strength rely more on societal norms than a biological fact? And it also is interesting, I thought, where the article was talking about aggression and how aggression is linked to men and emotions are linked to women, and the idea that because a woman has cycles, we're more emotional, but men also tend to fluctuate through hormonal cycles. So I thought that was interesting, and also in terms of the quote where it said, "Why are we so quick to say would you want the hands of a woman with PMS on the button to detonate a nuclear bomb when the man currently, oh, well, that was my take, when the man currently in charge is more irrational and emotional and uncontrollable than any woman? So I thought that was interesting that they said, would you want the hands of a woman who's PMSing on the button to detonate a nuclear bomb, when in all reality, the person that is currently in charge is 100 times more irrational or emotional than any woman I've ever seen going through her cycle. So research also shows there's very little difference between the physical brain of a woman and a man, and rather the perceived differences are learned. So there were a couple theories mentioned. The social learning theory suggests children learn gender-related behavior from their social constructs, and gender develops based on negative and positive reinforcements to these situations. The cognitive development theory suggests children's minds mature as they gain an understanding of gender roles and self-identity without external reinforcement, and instead they socialize themselves into feminine or masculine identities through 4 steps. Androgyny is a mixture of feminine and masculine, so this allows for a more open-minded view of things. Another important point is that culture is different everywhere, so one view of gender is different from culture to culture, and not one view is right or wrong or the same. And when those cultural aspects collide, it's intersectionality. And then another term that was mentioned was intercultural gender communication. And this happens when both culture and gender significantly influence what you say or how you relate to a person. On to the next article, Sex and Gender Through the Prism of Difference. What it's basically saying is, while we need to be wary of simplistic slogans that sum up the essence of relations between men and women, it's also a mistake to conclude that all individuals are totally unique. The book is named Prism of Difference because it analyzes a spectrum of people in order to show how gender is organized and kind of experienced differently when refracted through the prism of sexual, racial, ethnic, social class, physical abilities, age, and national citizenship differences. So it also states that it's okay to make generalizations about women and men, but we have to ask what men and what women, because we're not all the same in our backgrounds, so those generalizations may not be accurate. It was also talking about how feminism, when it first kind of started in the 70s, is a little bit different and outdated from what it is now. So in the 70s, the way of studying gender in terms of differences between men and women is an overgeneralization, and it's also the basis of men's power and domination. The idea of gender stereotypes occurs because not all men and women are the same, so we think, well, this is the male stereotype, this is the woman stereotype, but not everyone is the same, and different factors have to be taken into place, such as race, class, national origin, and what we think of masculinity is not fixed, so power is central to understanding differences. Okay, I'm back. So, power is central to understanding differences because white masculinity is very different from somebody of a minority group. So, white masculinity is going to be very different from black masculinity because those experiences are different. What a white man goes through on a day-to-day basis is completely and totally different from what a black man may go through on a daily basis. So it's important to understand that these masculinities and femininities are kind of just all in relation to other cultural factors. Another point was that in order to have masculine, you need to have feminine and vice versa. The terms rely on each other to have meaning, so you can't have feminine without understanding masculine, and you can't have masculine without understanding feminine. And once again, not all masculinity is the same because there are masculine oppressed groups. On to the next one, which is perspectives on sex, gender, and difference. This section introduces us to the ideas that will be covered in the readings to follow. So there were a couple different readings included in this, just kind of gave us an introduction to those. So it emphasizes that men and women are different, and all women are grouped into one category, but then do white women and women of color experience the same thing? So if men and women are different and women are one group, then do all women experience the same thing? Because obviously not, because my experience is going to be completely different as a upper middle class white woman than that of a, of an immigrant or of someone of a lower class family or someone who is of color. I can't understand those experiences because I've never been through them. So their experience with femininity and their gender is going to be completely different from mine. Difference feminism is a term that rested on the notion that women's distinctive characteristics required a special approach to overcoming discrimination. Today it has become more clear, though, that women and men everywhere are constructed in opposition to each other. The categories of women and men have vast meanings. So gender is complicated because it isn't just about men and women. It's about all of the intersecting pieces like race, ethnicity, national origin, class, things of that nature. Okay. Class and race play a huge role in this. So as I said before, my experience is going to be different from somebody else's. So for example, I have a friend who immigrated here from Mexico and is a dreamer, and her experience is a lot different than mine being here in the States as a woman. She's also a lesbian, so her experience is a lot different. One, because she's not really a citizen here. She fears a lot with the current state of things that she's going to be deported, and she also just 2 years ago discovered that she liked women. So for her experience is a lot different than mine is as a woman, and that's because of the backgrounds that we both have. The next article is The Five Sexes Revisited. So the five sexes mentioned in this article by Anne Fausto Sterling were male, female, hermaphrodite or herms, and then merms, and then firms. That's not a mouthful. I don't know what it is. Herms are born with ovaries and testes. Merms are born with testes and some aspect of female genitalia, and firms have ovaries with some aspect of male genitalia. So that was all new to me. Of course, I knew about a hermaphrodite, but I had never heard the term merms or firms before, so that was interesting. The author states that the boundaries outlining males and females has become harder to define, and that's because of intersexuality. The concept of intersexuality is rooted in the idea of male and female. In the idealized biological world, human beings are divided into two distinct categories. Men have the XY chromosome and women have the XX chromosome. But it isn't so clear-cut and concise as research has shown. Those who identify outside of this mold are called intersexuals. She pointed out that 1.7% of children born are intersex. Something on that note that I didn't know was that if a child is born with an inherited CAH gene from both parents, it can lead to the baby being born masculinized male genitalia, and who possesses two X chromosomes and the reproductive internal organs of a potentially fertile woman. So I thought that was really interesting. That was something that I had never heard of before. There was a case that she mentioned of a man named John who had surgery as an infant and became Joan, and for a while the surgery worked successfully and Joan was Joan and identified as such, but after a while he rejected the female assignment. So the article is essentially talking about how doing corrective infantile surgery, just the pros and cons of that, and that's one case of it. It argued that doctors should spend more time on ethical decisions when it comes to infantile surgery, and it states that male and female and masculine and feminine cannot be put on some continuum, but rather sex and gender are best conceptualized as points in a multidimensional space. That's a mouthful, but I think it's true. She wrote that since she had written this article, she had received a little bit of criticism, and she now accepts that point of view from the person who kind of criticized it and said that she now accepts the point of view that intersexuals and people should turn their viewpoint away from genitals and instead should focus on people's common and even wider assortment of sexual identities and characteristics. And so basically just stating that instead of focusing on whether someone has a male part or a female part, I should say has a penis or a vagina, or whatever the situation may be, we shouldn't be focusing on that. We should focus on the assortment of sexual identities that that person can have and sexual characteristics rather than just fixating on that one aspect of genitalia. The next article was Postmodern Feminism. Postmodern feminism argues that sex, sexuality, and gender are shifting, fluid, multiple categories, and they do not exist without identity and display. It is quoted that equality will come when there are so many recognized sizes and sexualities and genders that one cannot be played against the other. It argues that because everything is a cultural construction, postmodernism can free feminism from the constraints of gender norms, body ideals, and heteronormativity. Judith Butler's concept of performity entails the process of making gendered selves that reproduce social norms of femaleness, maleness, femininity, masculinity, heterosexuality, and homosexuality. You can't separate the doer from the doing. So kind of like it referenced, you can't separate the dancer from the dancing. Postmodernism includes deconstruction. So postmodernism examines the ways that society creates beliefs about gender, and at any time with discourses embedded in cultural representations or texts. So it referenced the example of soap operas and action movies and how soap operas are more aligned with a feminine viewer audience and action movies with a masculine viewer audience, and how all these media sources have subliminal messages that tell us something about female bodies, male bodies, sexual desire, and gender roles. And we don't think of the way this influences the world, and we don't really give it a second thought, but this is shaping the way that our gender is viewed and how we view the world and how we view other people. It also mentioned how queer theory is basically, in doing queer theory, doing gender, body, or sexuality can be non-conforming. What you wear and how you use your body are signs of gender and sexual orientation. These can be flaunted and played with and mixed up how we want, so you don't have to conform to one thing. Queer theorists claim such mixed gender displays create a freer social space for people, and they suggest that there can be many sexes, sexualities, and genders, and that they will be fluid and constantly in play. So you aren't just one thing and you aren't two things or three things. You're a mixture of everything, and it can surface at different times, and that you can play it with it different ways and act on it in different ways, and that it doesn't just have to be this like constricting thing. And then lastly for that one, it points out that social construction feminism argues that the gendered social order is constantly stabilized by individual action, but postmodern feminism has shown how individuals can consciously, purposefully create disorder and gender instability, opening the way to social change. So I think what that means is just by playing around with things and deconstructing the way that we see things, we can create a more freer space and allow for social change. The next article was Pressure to Perform. So this one was about a baseball player who went to college and kind of soon found out that because he was no longer on the baseball team, he felt that he wasn't judged how he used to be. So he asked a friend if they wanted to get coffee after class to study and chat, and the guy thought he was asking him out on a date, which wasn't actually what that was, but I guess the guy had these preconceived notions of how a male friendship should be, and so that guy thought he was asking him on a date. And then he went on to further talk about how he was talking to his sister who had an eating disorder, about what it stemmed from, and how these issues came about. And she was talking about the pressure to look a certain way, and you look in magazines and you see how the magazines tell you you need to be a size 00 and you need to have breasts that are perky and a waist that is tiny, and it just kind of messed with her sense of self. And then reflecting on himself, he saw how the men's health magazines he was reading definitely exaggerated and emphasized masculinity, and how he needed to be masculine, and how even his friends were making him feel like he needed to be masculine, and that he had this pressure to perform, hence the name of the article. He went out to a party with some friends, and his friends criticized him for not essentially wanting to have a one-night stand with this girl, because he was more of a relationship guy, and people were going to think he was a nerd or think he was whatever. And he decided at the end of it, maybe I should just join the baseball team again, even though I was always under the pressure to perform and working myself into the ground and all of these things. Nobody questioned me or my sexuality or who I was as a guy, because I was a jock. And that's what that article was about, just the pressure to perform and conform to this male expectation or masculine expectation in society. The last one was Gender, Class, and Terrorism. This one I found probably the most interesting out of all of them, because I'd never heard a comparison on gender and terrorism before. So it examines the idea that terrorism and violence may be a result of gender expectations, and it points out that, on 9/11, we kind of ignored the countless women who risked their lives on that day and focused solely on these men who were firefighters or policemen and all of these things, and forgot to, think about the women who risked their lives that day. But further than that, it talks about a couple of men in particular who had had a lot of violence or acted violent in a very large way. So it talked about the 9/11 bombing, the Oklahoma City bombing, and briefly about Hitler. And it talked about McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, and how this is an example of male entitlement and how that causes terrorism. He wrote a letter stating that the legacy of the American middle class had been stolen, and 2 years later blew up the federal building in Oklahoma. He was representative of the small legion of white supremacists who were usually lower middle class, typically uneducated outside of high school, and they feel a sense of downward mobility and economic uncertainty from changing times. They feel that they need to take back what is rightfully theirs as Americans, and they often fixate their anger on hate on others, such as women, members of minority groups, immigrants, gay men, lesbians, and they do this partially because they feel people are taking opportunities away from them, and that builds hate, and hate builds violence, and violence builds terrorism. What holds this group together is a rhetoric of masculinity. They feel emasculated and claim others have been handed the birthright of native-born white men. So a lot of toxic masculinity and entitlement there. What was interesting was the 9/11 attacks were all young middle-class men who felt their careers were taken away from them, or they weren't given an equal chance, and they felt they needed to recover their manhood from the emasculating politics of globalization. Um, what unites the three men mentioned in this article, McVeigh, Hitler, and one of the guys involved in 9/11, Atta, is one, their gender and their masculinity and their sense of masculine entitlement to their thwarted ambitions, is how the article put it. They accepted these cultural definitions of masculinity and that they needed to get the job as a doctor or be this powerful person or be successful. And when those things didn't work and they fell short, they felt they needed to blame someone because they failed to measure up. So they blamed the people who were these minority groups or women or whatever the situation may be, Jewish people, they blamed these people because they failed to measure up. So the events of 9/11, the Oklahoma City bombing resulted from an increasingly common combination of massive male displacement that comes with globalization, the spread of American consumerism, and the perceived corruption of local political elites. And then you mix all of that together in a pot with a masculine sense of entitlement, and it is a recipe for violence and terrorism. So I am finished, and I apologize that sometimes I cannot get my words out completely, and that I stumble and that I fumble. My mind goes a million miles an hour, but I am done. Thank you.